In December of 1903, the Wright brothers defied gravity and successfully flew the world's first aircraft. The risks they took were enormous. Every single time they got into their machine, they risked their lives. They broke bones, pushed themselves to the absolute breaking point, and endured the harsh criticism of the entire world. That first flight lasted only 12 seconds and covered just 120 feet, but it marked the beginning of the age of aviation. 60 short years later, it went even further.
Used to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. A few years before mankind ascended to the heavens, in 1948, in the wake of World War II, a small German company that once made some of the most advanced military vehicles the world had ever seen set their sights on not just making cars, but the best sports cars the world had ever seen. Ferdinand Porsche had already established an automotive consulting firm that had found some success creating a certain Volkswagen. He had built a reputation as an incredible engineer during the war, also developing boats, trains, tanks, and even engines for planes. He was largely responsible for just how advanced Germany's military was. When the war ended, he focused all his efforts on making a race car. But it was really his son Ferrari that would see that dream to fruition. What was built would change the automobile industry forever, and you already know what it is. If I told you to close your eyes and imagine a Porsche, I bet you'd be imagining the 911. That's because the 911 is iconic. From the very first year, it has always been known as the absolute pinnacle of performance cars. The benchmark, if you will, and to be frank, not much is even close. The 356 that the 911 is based upon, the first time they ever took that car racing, it won its class at Le Mans. The most difficult and grueling race there is, where even the most experienced drivers in the world have made the ultimate sacrifice. The 911 was a bigger, more extreme 356, with a flat 6 motor as opposed to the flat 4, and it too carried on the tradition of winning. This was all based on an idea that critics and engineers alike said will never work. You can't put the engine in the back of the car, it would never be stable. It would swing out on corners, and yet Ferdinand Porsche did just that. Not only did it work, on the racetrack it obliterated everything. Porsche would go on to absolutely dominate every facet of motorsports. However, the bigger they got, the more they risked. And in the early 1970s, Porsche had a big problem. Nobody was buying them. Allow me to paint a picture. In the era of boring one-size-fits-all American cars that came after the death of muscle, other issues in the US like Watergate, war, and protests had taken their toll on many things. But the auto industry was largely in shambles and struggling to keep up with new emissions and labor laws. And then the oil crisis pushed them even further on a downward spiral. Porsche was on the verge of bankruptcy, and at the helm of then-chairman Ernst Fuhrmann had some big decisions to make. And to understand these decisions, we must first understand the problem with the 911, or rather the problem with rear-engine cars in general. Despite how capable the 911 was, it wasn't particularly easy to drive. That rear-engine design helps give the rear tires lots of grip, but in a corner, if you lifted off the throttle at the wrong moment, that weight would come forward and you'd crash. If you came into a corner too hot, you'd have to keep on the throttle and ride the slide, so to speak, and hopefully you had enough skills to keep it on the road. To drive a 911 at the limit was to risk it all, being known by some as the Widowmaker. If you could tame the beast, you had one of the best performing cars of all time. That's partly what made the 911 so exciting to drive. But to sell that to the general public and any idiot with enough cash was crazy. The allure of danger might have been enticing to thrill seekers, but not to Porsche's legal team, which was under heavy scrutiny. The other problem was it was just plain difficult to build. Having the engine, transmission, catalytic converters, and exhaust all cramped into a small rear engine bay made new emission laws and noise control difficult. It was a time-consuming and expensive car to make. Because of all this, coupled with the gas crisis and stagnant innovation, the 911 wasn't selling. So Ernst Fuhrman decided that the 911 had ran its course and wanted to usher in a new halo car to save the company and sell more cars in the US. He wanted to design a car that would solve all the problems of the 911, and he was willing to risk it all. It's important to remember how close Porsche was to bankruptcy. If this new model didn't sell after dumping their last bit of cash into development, there would have been no more Porsche. So late one night, presumably after copious amounts of beer, he had everyone in the company meet and discuss the new car. The committees all gathered around and said what they wanted the new car to be like. The safety committee wanted taller headlights, and so it would be safer, 4 seats. The design team wanted a car to be sleeker and have 2 seats. The fuel efficiency guys wanted a little 4-cylinder engine. And the engine guys wanted a V10 that was 2 5-cylinder Audi engines put together. And yes, seriously, they considered that during the gas crisis. The accountants did not like that one bit, and it was quickly nixed. And that's pretty much my interpretation of what happened, and 6 years later we ended up with the Porsche 928. Their new flagship, a stark departure from the typical sports car they were used to building in an attempt to make them a luxury brand. This is crazy to think about because luxury is the complete opposite of race cars. The front-engine GT missile to rival the likes of Mercedes and BMWs of the time. It debuted in 1977 at the Geneva Motor Show and took the world by storm. Mercedes and BMW looked on with envy as reporters and the public flocked to the 928. The space-age design looked like nothing else on the road. While other cars had protruding metal bumpers, the 928 would start the trend of integrated plastic bumpers that we see today. The interior was small for a GT, more like a cockpit with leather seats, the way a Porsche should be. It introduced the center console design as opposed to just bolting the transmission lever to the floor like every car before it. And that's now in virtually every car. It received praise from car journalists at the time as the next step in Porsche's story, a radical departure from the beloved 911, but there was something exciting in how new and fresh it was. The pretty little wedge from Germany was a hit. The 928 stood alone as a look to a brighter future. The car companies could still innovate, still start from scratch and build something you could dream about, even if it was a front-engine saloon similar by design to what everyone else was making at the time. It felt different. They gave it a 4.5-liter V8 that was mated to a 3-speed Mercedes automatic transmission. There was also a manual, but that's quite rare, but it ensured that the car had plenty of passing power. Being a Porsche, it had to be equally fast in a corner, and by using a transaxle design, they were able to get perfect 50-50 weight distribution, which made sure it would keep up with the top trim 911. They also made sure it had a long wheelbase of 98 inches and designed the Weissach axle to make sure that it wouldn't oversteer like the 911. I'm sure the safety committee was very happy. The Weissach axle is very significant to Porsche. See, when a car oversteers, the rear tires have a tendency to toe out and lose grip. The Weissach axle made them toe in and increase grip when you needed it most. This wouldn't make the car faster on the track, but it made it way easier and safer to drive. It was the Porsche for people who wanted the prestige without the difficulty of driving the 911. And if you wanted one, you had to pay the price. The starting cost was $28,000. Or in today's money, almost 140 grand. They had the car. They knew it was good, all the performance of the 911, and an easy and comfortable to drive package. But that's not enough. See, the 911 was always more than the sum of its parts. It was iconic after all. And if the 928 wanted to replace the 911 and save the company, it had to be too. Fast forward to the early 80s, and the 928 was selling okay. Enough units every year to keep them in business, but Barely. Ball players, movie stars, and CEOs were the only people who could afford these machines, and by now the competition was getting more difficult to compete with. Porsche was once again on the verge of bankruptcy, and there were rumors of Mercedes buying them out. So they did something radical and appointed an American as the new CEO. Peter Schutz, who was a rather unknown engineer for Caterpillar at the time, would now be in control of Porsche's future. The 911 was scheduled for discontinuation, so that they could focus more on the 928. Peter Schutz kept hearing workers complain about the 911 going away and how everyone who worked there would miss making the 911. So at a board member meeting, Peter Schutz told the executives that the 911 and the 928 needed to coexist. So he went up to a wall in the office that had a printout of the 911 with the timeline coming to an end. And he drew a line off the page and onto the wall, saving the 911.
And I extended the 911 all the way to the end of the chart, continued it on the wall of his office to the corner, around the corner, behind his desk, and over to the window behind his desk. And I said, Mr. Bott, do we understand each other?
Production on the next generation started immediately, and the engineers were ecstatic. And as for the 928, Porsche would go on to release some hotter models, like the S, which had a bigger 4.7-liter V8, and they marketed it as the fastest naturally aspirated production vehicle at the time, hitting 146 miles per hour. That added cool factor and danger was exciting, and the 928 started picking up more sales. It had gone from a cool GT car that might have been a bit too well-mannered for its own good to a bullet, and people started to take notice. Director Paul Brickman was looking for a Porsche to star in his big movie, and he didn't just want any Porsche. He wanted a 928. After the hit film Risky Business, the 928 started to pop up all over the place, from Tony Montana driving one in Scarface to Weird Science. The 928 had taken over Hollywood. From there, things only got more exciting. The new for 1986 S4 model got an even bigger than the S 5-liter V8, and Porsche sent it to Bonneville Salt Flats to prove just how fast it had gotten, where it easily set the land speed record for naturally aspirated production vehicles at over 170 miles an hour on its second attempt.
Pretty nifty.
Porsche went on to wrap up the last few years of the 928 with the GTS, the best yet. It came with big flared fenders and bigger 17-inch wheels, bigger front brakes, bigger engine with a displacement of 5.4 liters that made over 350 horsepower and had a 5-second 0 to 60 time, which meant it was a seriously quick car for its time. The elephant in the room, however, was the price tag. At over $100,000 in 1990s money, or almost $200,000 in today's money, the 928 became one of the most expensive cars in the world at the time. To put that in perspective, it was about the same price as a Ferrari F355. People of the internet would lead you to believe that the 928 was a failure. But that couldn't be further from the truth. In its 18-year, one-generation run, the 928 cemented Porsche as a luxury brand, which paved the way for new models like the Boxster Cayman pair and the Cayenne that would save them once again. It led to technical innovations like the Weissach axle that's in nearly every modern Porsche, and started the trend of integrated bumpers and center consoles that we see today. It was the car that, because it could sit comfortably at high speeds, allowed Jeremy Clarkson to see his dad one last time. The 911 had to always exist. It's the halo car, the poster in your bedroom that you dream about. The assumption that they needed to compete was wrong, but in order to keep that dream alive, Porsche had to expand its lineup, and the 928 marked that new chapter for the German company.